This Zoom message covers Romans 7 from verse 7 to the end of the chapter. At the end of verse 6, Paul says that we've died to the law and it now has no effect on us. The word he uses here is a word we've come across before. It's this word katergeo, which, if you were able to listen to the section on the first part of Romans 6, I explained the meaning of this word as making something powerless. So the question arises that if we're saying that the law has no more power over us, because we're now out of the realm or the kingdom where law exists, are we saying that escaping the authority and power of the law is also suggesting that the law itself is a sinful thing? And Paul uses the same expression that he's already used twice in Romans 6, a very strong absolutely not. Shall we continue to sin that grace may abound, he asks in Romans 6? Absolutely not. Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? Absolutely not. Are we saying that the law is sinful? Absolutely not. But Paul goes on to say that if it weren't for the law, he wouldn't have known what sin was. He only found out about coveting because the law said, don't covet. And he explains this by saying in verse 8, sin seized the opportunity that the commandment presented and produced all sorts of covetous desires. Now, let me explain something about the commandments. They're summed up in the two great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And the outworking of love is giving. Remember that verse, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So the opposite of giving is taking. And the 10 commandments are largely all about what you're not permitted to take. Another word for that taking is stealing. So you have the 8th commandment, do not steal. But what about the others? You shall have no other gods before me. Don't steal worship to God and give it to an idol. Don't misuse God's name. Don't steal honor due to God. Don't murder. Steal a person's life. Don't commit adultery. Steal a person's wife. Don't give false testimony. Steal a person's reputation. And finally, don't covet, which is the commandment dealing with the desire to take something that you shouldn't. Now, you might be able to keep the outward commandments, but mastering the very desire itself is a different thing. And apart from the law, sin is not able to work, because you can't accuse someone of breaking a commandment if the commandment has never been spoken in the first place. In verse 15 onwards, Paul keeps saying, I did this, I found out that. Who's he talking about? Himself or someone else? And at what stage in their life is he describing this experience? There are 4 possible answers, but I'll not spend much time on considering each one and just simply state which I think is most likely. The first one, Paul as a committed Jew before he had an encounter with Jesus. Secondly, Paul after he had his encounter with Jesus. 3, not Paul at all, but the story of Adam before he ate the forbidden fruit. And 4, not Paul, but everybody's experience with Paul saying I to add effect to the story. Now, it's most unlikely that this is a description of Paul after his encounter with Jesus. Romans 6 makes no sense at all about the power of sin being broken if Romans 7 is what Paul is experiencing. And now, although there are hints of Adam and Eve in the garden, this is a story of a man familiar with the 10 commandments, especially coveting. And that's long after the Garden of Eden story. And although many people can relate to the experience of Romans 7, it best describes Paul as a devoted Jew before meeting Christ on the road to Damascus. Now, verse 9 says, once I was alive. What does that mean? Well, it's most likely the time before his bar mitzvah. That's the Jewish ceremony where a Jew ceases to be regarded as a child and becomes responsible himself for keeping the law. But when the commandment came, that's the time when he became responsible to keep the law, sin became an issue for him and he died. Verse 10 says, the very commandment that was there to bring life, because walking in God's ways does bring life as it's meant to be lived, but instead it brought death because Paul transgressed. Note how Paul uses the word sin in verses 8, 9, 11, and 13. He talks about sin as though it was an actual being. And this is an important thing to notice about the work of the devil. The devil disguises himself and uses things and people to trap and deceive us into committing sin. Paul wasn't being deceived into eating unclean meat. He wasn't being tempted to mix with Gentiles. He was enticed into sin by the thing he loved the most, the very law that he as a Jew was privileged to have received. Remember the same thing with Jesus. Jesus used the scripture to say why he wasn't going to turn stones into bread. But in the second temptation in Matthew, where the devil takes him to the pinnacle of the temple, the devil uses scripture to get him to jump down to the ground. The scriptures say he will guard you so that you won't even dash your foot on a stone. There's nothing wrong with the Bible, the scriptures, the law. As Paul says, they're holy, righteous, good. So if there's nothing bad about the law, was it the law that provoked him to sin? No, says Paul. It was sin using the law. And because it used something good to do this, it showed how bad sin really was. Paul describes himself as unspiritual, like a slave in the market, sold to sin, the buyer. Now, let me run through the remainder of the chapter, starting at verse 15. 15 says, I don't understand myself. I don't do what I want to do, that is, keep the law. I end up doing what I hate doing, which is committing sin. And verse 16, if I do what I don't want to do, part of me is saying the law is good. So it's not the real me doing this evil, it's sin living in me, and it's working in me. Verse 18, I know that nothing good lives in my flesh. That's the Greek word sarx, flesh, the sinful nature. I know that nothing good lives in my flesh. I have the desire to do good, but I can't actually find a way to do it. What I actually end up doing is not the good I want to do, but the evil I don't want to do. And if that is the case, that I'm doing what I don't want to do, then it's not me, but sin living in me that's doing it. So I find in verse 21, says Paul, I find this principle at work. When I want to do good, evil is there. In my inner being, he says, in my mind, I delight in God's law. But he says in verse 23, there's another law at work in my member and the members of my body pulling me into sin. Another law at work. Let me explain this from an example from physics. If I hold a rubber ball in my hand and then let it go, it will drop. That's the law of gravity. But you'll notice that when the ball hits the ground, it bounces back up again. And it may do that several times until it finally lies on the ground. That bouncing back is called Hooke's law, where it states that elastic objects like a ball or an elastic band, when it's stretched or deformed, it'll change back to its original shape. So when a ball hits the ground, the hardness of the ground puts it out of shape. Hooke's law then applies, and the force of the law pushes it back into shape, and in doing so, it bounces up again. But which law is stronger? Hooke's law or the law of gravity? And the answer is gravity, and it keeps pulling the ball down. And Paul says there are two laws at work. One in my mind saying that the law is good, and sin working in my body, fighting against my mind and making me a prisoner of sin. In other words, the law of sin is stronger than the law in his mind. And he says, I'm in a wretched position. How awful I feel about myself. Who'll rescue me from this awful state? And then in verse 25, he says, thanks be to God, Jesus will rescue me. So in summary, Paul in this chapter is saying, in my mind, I'm a slave to God's law. I always see it as right. A mind thinks, but doesn't act. So my mind always thinks that God's law is right. But in my flesh, the fallen part of me where sin dwells, I'm a slave to sin. And it's the stronger force. And I therefore end up committing sin in my body, which is the place where I act out what's going on in my sinful nature. The gospel message is that Jesus rescues us from the flesh. The flesh that always pulls us into sin.